Welcome. Right from the time of independence, India has had a fraught relationship with capitalism. Unlike countries like the United States or the UK, India never embraced capitalism and creative destruction. And therefore, Ruchir's book on what went wrong with capitalism is largely written in the American context. But he is an original thinker. So what I thought was, we'd go beyond the syllabus, we'd go beyond what's written in his book and actually try and apply some of the concepts and topics that he's touched upon in the US context to the Indian context and examine the state of capitalism at the moment in India and look forward to where we seem to be heading given the economic and political pulls and pressures at play. Ladies and gentlemen, at the Business Today India at 100 Summit, join me in raising a warm round of applause as we welcome for this special keynote session Ruchir Sharma. Thank you very much, Ruchir, for joining us here.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. So thank you. I want you to start by giving us a temperature check of what you think about the state of capitalism in India at the moment relative to what's happening globally. So we'll start from there and then we'll examine where we could potentially be headed. Ruchir.
Right. So I think at the basic level, we have to define what exactly is capitalism. And in very basic terms, the way I define capitalism is about giving people economic freedom and allowing economic initiative to flower on its own, right? So economic freedom for me is the basic definition of capitalism. Now, if you look at India, the thing which always struck me, in fact, the book's journey begins in India, struck me was that we gave our people political freedom after 1947, but we never gave our people economic freedom. So if you look at the rankings, for example, of economic freedom, India consistently ranked in the bottom quartile, right, of the countries in the world. And if you look at India's rankings on a per capita income basis, that's really the key in terms of measuring economic success. India's rankings on a per capita income basis, virtually till the 1980s, kept on slipping compared to the rest of the world. So we were in the bottom quartile of also per capita income rankings. Then from the 1980s and 19 onwards, both things began to change. We started to give our people much more economic freedom, moving towards a more market-oriented system, and our per capita income rankings started to move up, and India also, in terms of its economic size, also once again, started to move up the league tables, right? So that's been India's trajectory. So yes, you're correct that we have never embraced capitalism fully, but I think that it's a journey. It's been a V-shaped journey, which is that in the first 30 to 40 years after independence, we gave our people very little economic freedom. They had all the political freedom, but little economic freedom. And after that, we have seen India also move down the path where you've got much more economic freedom. And we have now moved up the rankings on the index of economic freedom. So I think that we've been moving in the right direction. The broad trajectory for India in the last 30 to 40 years has been in the right direction. There are obviously ebbs and flows in that, but broadly, and we have clearly achieved much greater economic success as we have given our people far greater economic freedom in the last 30 to 40 years.
I don't think anybody would doubt or question if I say that in Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we probably had and have the best hope for capitalism, free enterprise. He's a big backer even at this moment. He came after the budget and spoke to industry about wealth creators, the need to encourage those who do investments, create jobs. I remember when he came to the India Today conclave as Chief Minister of Gujarat in 2013, he spoke very famously about the government having no business of being in government, maximum governance, minimum government. And yet over the past 10 years, Ruchir, we've seen just how difficult translating those noble ideas into action really have been. Just this morning, the government took back a decision to allow for lateral entrance into government services because of a pushback from the political opposition. So given what he said, how do you evaluate what's happened over the past 10 years? And then we'll get into what happens from here.
Right. So I think that, there are two ways that I see the government's performance, right, in terms of how I see it outsider. One is the pure macroeconomic management. I think on the pure macroeconomic management, this government's done a pretty good job, which is that if you look at inflation, you look at the broad deficit numbers, resisting the temptation to go for some crazy stimulus after the pandemic and stuff, the macroeconomic management of the government has been broadly stable. I've disagreed with some of the steps this government's taken, such as demonetization. I think, like in terms of that, also the way that the way GST had too many issues, like in the way like it was rolled out, but broadly from a macroeconomic management standpoint, and especially in the second term, I would say, it's been a pretty decent performance as far as the government's concerned, and all the data backs it up. The issues I've had with the government have got to do much more on the micro side in terms of what the government's done. You spoke about this entire concept of minimum government like out there. And yet, if you look at on things like privatization, there's been no success that this government's really had on privatization. It's been very small. Some finally, like you've had privatization, some airline after years and stuff. There's been no systematic thought through as far as privatization is concerned. Secondly, it remains a very tough place for India to do, for foreigners to do business in. Like you speak to them, the regulatory stuff that they have to go through. And the one thing I've been very critical of the government have been the power given to the investigative agencies. We spoke about that even last time. I think that these are things which have really hurt in terms of private investment from doing even better. Why do we still have a migration of people shifting bases out of the country? Something I raised back in 2018 in terms of what's happening. So I think there's been a big split. And the other thing which I think the Prime Minister has changed is that when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, he spoke a lot about competitive federalism, about how the various states need to be doing, because he would be on the wrong side of that the tendency in Delhi is to centralize, is to take like as much power as possible. He would not like that because when he was the Gujarat Chief Minister. But I think that one thing which even he's had a tendency to do is to centralize things far more when he's been in power. So I think that so that's a distinction I want to draw, that from a macroeconomic management standpoint, it's a pretty good job that we have seen the government do. From a micro standpoint, I think that on the ground, and this is the reason why if you look at the amount of foreign investment we are attracting, it's still very low. I mean, the FDI numbers in India are still about 1% of GDP or something on a gross basis. When, China in its boom years was doing 4%, Korea, Taiwan, 4%. Today, Vietnam's doing 4% of GDP in terms of FDI. So why are we not doing much more on that front? I think those are issues we have to look at. So I think this very important distinction between the macro and the micro.
You write in your book, Ruchir, that capitalism is in a crisis globally, right? Particularly in the United States. I want you to examine where capitalism is in India with an eye on the future. Because there are two things at play. You've got the BJP talking about economic reform, but facing a very strong political backlash when they did land acquisition, when they tried to push the farm laws, or when they tried disinvestment, and therefore they kind of soft-pedaled on it. On the other hand, you've got leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi, and others wanting to take a very different welfare state approach. Despite India's low per capita numbers, unlike countries in Europe, they're still wanting to go the whole hog on welfare. Therefore, given these pulls and pressures and the fact that we're now seeing the government without having a full majority, where do you see this allow for market forces and capitalism take India in the next few years?
So firstly, I'd say that what people say in the opposition and what they do in government is very different. So I would sort of discount many of these statements in terms of, what, like he says, because look at what the chief ministers of the Congress party are doing in their states. Right? So,
but I disagree with that because what they say in opposition has an impact on what the government can and cannot do.
Yeah, absolutely. But no matter who's in opposition, I've seen this in country after country, that the idea is to oppose whatever the government at the center is doing. There's a natural tendency like to do that. It's very rare. It's only when India was in a period of economic crisis that the BJP backed the Congress, like in terms of doing something with economic reforms back in 91, 92 and stuff. But generally, of course it has an impact. But I'm saying that I just don't feel that whichever would be the opposition party, I'd say that the natural tendency is to oppose these things in terms of whether it's for India's good or not. I think that there's a natural tendency to do that. So, but you're right. I think that again, what this government has done, to its credit, has shifted the balance a bit, which is that under the UPA, they went overboard on dole-outs and on, like in terms of welfare, and they didn't focus enough on infrastructure and stuff. But they paid a huge price for it, remember. Inflation was out of control and I think it's one of the underappreciated factors that in India's case, we have done work on this, we don't know whether economic growth wins you elections or not, but inflation definitely loses you elections. There's no government that's won elections in this country when inflation's been high, either at a state or at a center level, right? So that's something which is there. So I think that any government of the day which is sensible and wants to hang on to power has to realize the fact that you cannot just carry on a one-way street. But I think the difference to me is much more marginal, which is the fact that what they do and say in opposition is very different than when they are in power. But having said that, the marginal is that the current government has shifted the balance a bit more in favor of infrastructure development and less so on populist kind of dole-outs. And there is a risk that the change of government, the balance may again shift, but they'll have to encounter one thing, that doing so is naturally inflationary, and you pay a huge political price for carrying out such policies.
So the fascinating thing about Ruchir Sharma is that he understands politics almost as well as he understands the markets, and he's as fascinated with politics as he is around the markets. And I was reading in the build-up your piece, which you wrote while you were traveling through the elections, where Ruchir said that he didn't see a wave, that they may still come to power, but they may not get the kind of seats that they're talking about, and that it may be a less than majority kind of government, and that there is no Modi wave wherever he's traveling. Now, in hindsight, all that looks 2020, so all the fancy polls and all the crores that they were paid, Ruchir will say, I just did a road trip and I pretty much reached the same conclusion. How do you see the nature of this government, Modi 3.0, being different from what India has seen in the past 10 years?
Well, I think that across the world, what we see generally is that when a leader's been in power for over 10 years, no matter how good he's been, and that's always a debate in this country, there's a natural fatigue which sets in. There's a natural fatigue level because someone's been in power for that long. For example, people keep asking me today that, has Rahul Gandhi really changed and stuff? I said, I'm not sure whether this is Rahul Gandhi has changed or people are just in a mood to see something new, and so they're propping, propping it up. So I just feel that the way that the country has moved today and the mood you're sensing is one of slight fatigue. Let's try something new. That's, I think, the broad, sort of feeling that I'm getting in this country. And when we were traveling, that's the feeling we picked up, that there were lots of people who we were talking to who were saying to us, कि अब ये बहुत एक तरफा हो गया है. The feeling that it's become too one-sided. So they just want to prop up whoever was on the other side. I feel that was a really underappreciated dynamic in this election.
So your politics, from what I understand of it, is on the liberal side. But as far as economics are concerned, you're very pro-markets.
Yes.
And therefore, let me ask you this, Ruchir Sharma, as an economist and as a stock markets analyst, are you scared of the kind of economics that Rahul Gandhi and the Congress party are pushing at this moment? Does it spook you? And if they were to actually implement everything that they're talking about, could you paint for this audience here what might actually happen to the Indian economy and to the India growth story?
No, absolutely. I'm saying that if I were to take it at face value, I would be spooked by it because that is not what I believe in. In my previous book that I wrote, Democracy on the Road, I was very open about the fact that, in my initial days, when I first started looking at Indian politics very closely and stuff, I'd be very fascinated that let's go meet Sonia Gandhi, let's speak to her about what economics is and stuff like that. And I came away feeling quite, as I openly said in the book, quite disappointed because I am a firm believer in capitalism. I'm a firm believer in free market economics. And when the response to me would come back would be the fact that this won't work in India. I'm like, but it hasn't been tried in India. So how do you think this won't work in India? So then I stopped those meetings. I've not met, just on record to say this, in the last 20 years, I've, as a matter of policy, never met any politician on a one-on-one basis. Because I feel that it's a waste of my time, it's a waste of their time. They have because it's very different. I'm much happier just being an observer of trends and stuff like that. So I'd say the fact that you're right, about that my politics and economics are very different. But from an economic
You can't
perspective,
split your vote. You can't say economically I vote this way, politically I vote this
yeah,
way.
but
That's not
I also feel the fact that that in this country, the fact is that when they come to power, the difference in what they do is also marginal. I've seen that too often. And the one thing also I believe in India a lot is the federalism of this country, which is that we spend so much time, and this is something I have to keep telling because I'm based in New York, keep telling the people there, we spend so much time thinking about Delhi, Modi, center. The state chief ministers in this country have a lot of power. There's a lot that they can do. And so something which I think, like the dynamic which has been unleashed, I think, is a form of competitive federalism. It's there today. Even this election, it played itself out. Between Maharashtra and Gujarat, there is a competitive stuff. In Maharashtra, when we were there, although it may have been a marginal factor, but the idea that a lot of the stuff is being usurped by Gujarat was something that the Uddhav Thackeray camp and all played into, even in the meetings and stuff like that. So I think this competitive federalism which has come in is a positive dynamic. It may appear a bit ugly at election time, but I'd say that that's there. The Congress similarly, and the BJP points this out, that you may criticize, that they may say something against the top industrialists, but the Congress chief ministers are in business with them. Right? So that's just the practicality of it.
So when you look at macro trends, what's your sense of the Indian stock markets at this moment? There is one perspective that the markets are overheated, that the price earning multiples are out of whack when looked at what's happening globally, and that India could be headed towards a correction. It could be a minor correction, major correction, that's up for debate, but that we're in overheated territory. The other is, look at this in a global context, that India is still the fastest growing large economy, and therefore, if you zoom out, there is still enough juice in the Indian story, and the BSE could be headed to 100,000 and the NSE could be headed to 25,000. What's your take on that?
Right. So I'd say that, the classic, what happens when we look at markets and stuff is that we all have classic models of ours. The classic models aren't working for India just now.
Why not?
Because of the fact that this domestic flow of money, this financialization trend that we are seeing has taken a momentum of its own. Right? Because India has been the most expensive stock market in the world now for a while. It's the one market in the world today which is even more expensive than the United States in terms of valuations, despite the US market being at record highs and stuff. So this is a market which is functioning on its own dynamic. The good thing is that it's so far been broadly supported, at least by fundamentals. A true bubble is one where the fundamentals are deteriorating, but the prices are going up. In India's case, there has been earnings growth in the stock market. So it's been backed up by earnings growth. There has been this wealth creation that's taken place on a genuine basis as well, as far as India is concerned. The economy is doing relatively well. It's not like a China type 9-10% economic growth, but it's doing relatively well today in terms of, if you look at around the world, what our growth rates are, stuff. As I said, the macroeconomic management has been decent. And the good thing about India is that there is no other emerging market in the world which offers a diversity of companies that India offers. I mean, if you look at other markets, let's say the other markets which are doing well, something like a Taiwan, or a Korea, it's one sector, technology out there. You go to a country like Brazil, it's so dominated, by commodities. Some other market is dominated by a couple of banks and stuff. In India's case, the diversity that we have out here and the depth that we have in this is unprecedented. So there's a lot to be done. So in India, I'd say, and there's one good news I'll say, which India can still look forward to, that this entire boom has been driven by domestic money so far. Foreign money has been largely absent from the stock market boom until the election. Now, across the world, the big trend that I've noticed is that people are overly concentrated in the US stock market today. The US economy today is about 26% of the global economy. The US stock market today is more than 50% of the global stock market value. And according to the MSCI indices, it's close to 70%. So 50 to 70% of your capital is allocated to America. And that has gone up dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. I think that that's bound to break. The dollar is bound to weaken, and and the capital flows are likely to come back to emerging markets, and India will be a beneficiary of that de facto. Now, I feel that other emerging markets are even cheaper and maybe bigger beneficiaries, but India will be a beneficiary. So yes, I'm concerned by this domestic one-way trade which we have had on this market.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Why? Because a lot of small retail investors, because they've seen the returns of the stock markets for several years, through the systematic investment plan route, are investing in domestic mutual funds.
Yes.
It can be argued that they have no other immediate alternatives. Like, this is the only route they have. So even if the fundamentals don't support it, this is where your local asset management companies are pumping in the money, because they have frankly nowhere else to go. I mean, the options to invest internationally for domestic retail investors are far fewer.
Well, some options are opening up. I would recommend to people that wherever possible, do diversify a bit, especially into other emerging markets, because they are much cheaper and they have decent growth prospects and they're improving. But in India's case as well, as I said, that I would begin to be much more concerned about the Indian stock market if our earnings growth began to decline, if in terms of the fact that our fundamentals began to decline, I'd be much more concerned about that. But
So at this moment, you're long India.
At this moment, India is one of the countries that I like. But yeah, I run a global emerging markets fund. I don't believe in putting eggs all in one basket. 5 years ago, everybody wanted to just be in Chinese tech, Tencent, Alibaba. We know how that ended. So in terms of, you have to be wary of these trends. But so far, as I said, that...
So when you look at the other emerging markets, Ruchir,
Yeah.
which ones look the hottest to you as
Yeah.
a 5-year horizon?
Well, yeah. So, for example, there's plenty of opportunity which people don't speak about. Like, for example, one thing I speak about is that in the world today, there are about 200 countries or so. Only 40 of them are classified as developed countries. Everything else is classified as emerging, and many of them from Brazil to Mexico have been emerging forever, right? Because they've always said that. But there are places like Eastern Europe, where, for example, the next country to become a developed country, it's very hard. It's very hard for a country which is emerging to become a developed country. The next country, I think, which is going to become a developed country is Poland. So that's a country that I've liked. I think places like Mexico, have near-term political volatility, but they're benefiting a lot from people moving to nearshoring. Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, in Southeast Asia, all these countries are doing relatively well and stuff like that as well. So I think that it's time to spread some capital around is my philosophy within emerging markets. But India, for me, will always remain, because none of these markets, the thing which India has got, is that none of these markets have the breadth and the depth of the Indian stock market. And that's what makes it such a powerful market to be engaged with. And therefore, this market has consistently outperformed other emerging markets over any time horizon. And this decade, of course, it's gone a bit vertical in terms of there's no country in the world which has created as much wealth in terms of billionaires, new billionaires, as India has created this decade.
So your heart is usually in India. A lot of your money is in the United States. I want to spend a moment talking to you about the state of play in the US.
Yes.
Because you've got Kamala Harris now talking about a bigger welfare state, a bigger role for government. And you've got Donald Trump talking about capitalism, even though in your book you say he's not as capitalistic as he seems on the outside, and several of his steps were a continuation of what was happening in the past. But how do you see this Harris versus Trump dynamic play out in the context of the impact that the winner would potentially have on American economic growth, the impact of the result on global growth, and the ripple effect on India?
Again, if we take just at face value, then obviously the Trump program is scarier for India, because he wants to impose tariffs across the board, right? So just doing that will be terrible for global growth. Now, I don't take these things at face value, because I feel that he's more of a deal maker. This is all negotiating tactics that you say, I'm going to do this. At the end, you strike a deal in terms of it, and you declare yourself a winner. So therefore, I hope that's the case. But at face value, if I were to take it, for the global economy, for them to do this is quite, for him to impose these tariffs is not good for India, is not good for the rest of the world. But here is the big thing which I find, and this is why, when I wrote my first book, Breakout Nations, 12 years ago, I was very skeptical of BRICS, if you recall in that book. And I ended that book by saying that the true breakout nation in the world is America. I wish I had invested my career accordingly, rather than do emerging markets. But anyway, I did emerging markets back then. But today I feel that America has become very overvalued. The currency is expensive, and they're taking their success for granted. That one thing I find shocking about this election campaign here is that today America is running a budget deficit in the middle of a major economic recovery of 6% of GDP. Their debt to GDP level is exploding on the upside, and yet both the candidates, they are saying deficits don't matter. What matters is Kamala Harris saying she wants to do more spending, Trump saying he wants to just cut taxes without any consequences.
Is America headed towards a recession, you think?
Well, I think that in terms of that, what America did was a massive stimulus. I think that stimulus effect is wearing off. Recession may be too strong a word, but the economy is slowing down. The Fed seems all set to cut interest rates, and I think that's good for markets like India and other places because the cost of capital around the world is likely to come down, and it's likely to lead to greater capital flows, I think, to emerging markets in general. So that's the good news. The
So do you see foreign
But the issue,
portfolio-
I mean, like in America, as I said, if I finish the American thought, is that I feel that America is going to have to confront its problems of running these incredible deficits, and the fact that capitalism in America today is so distorted. These are problems I feel a new leader, whether it's Harris or Trump, will have to confront in 2025. So I feel 2025 could be quite a breakthrough year in which capital begins to leave America because of the domestic problems and finds its way into other countries. So today, I feel exactly the opposite of what I felt when I wrote my first book, when I was very bullish on America, bearish on many emerging markets and the BRIC concept. Today, I feel that there's too much capital over allocated to America and under allocated to the rest of the world, and I see that capital switch underway now.
One of the things Prime Minister Modi talks about is that by 2047, he hopes that India will be a developed economy. If you were to look at all the factors that seem at play in your windscreen right now, do you think that's the growth trajectory that we're on? Is that the path that you think India is headed towards?
Well, India's trajectory, I think, is broadly positive, but there's no way any math would support us becoming a developed economy by 2047. Because if you're going to keep growing at 6% a year, which is what the growth rate seems to be, and I don't think there's so much reform on the anvil, which is going to take our growth rate to 9-10%. At a 6% growth rate a year, we're going to struggle to be a middle-income country by 2047. Because remember, what's middle income today? The bar moves higher because the rest of the world also grows, by 2 or 3% a year. So India is on the right trajectory. But these are slogans, these are political stuff. For us to become a developed country by 2047, we'll have to grow at 10-12% real GDP per year, or be close to that, even to be a middle-income country. So the issue for us is that our per capita income today is $3,000. You do the math in terms of that if we grow at 6% a year, even in dollar terms or whatever, how much are we going to sort of be able to become a middle-income country by then? It's not possible with a 6% type economic growth rate. For that, you need 10-12% type.
No, but
real
can I
GDP growth rate.
counter-argue to say that the era of 10-12% growth,
Yes.
which China witnessed at the peak of globalization, is now just because of global mega trends, just very difficult to achieve. So it's not India's fault. It's just that the speed at which you grow is relative to what's happening in the rest of the world, Ruchir.
I completely agree with you. So, I'm not trying to say. So you asked me the specific question on whether we'll become a developed country by 2047.
So your answer is no.
My answer is that at 6% economic growth rate, you just mathematically can't get there, is my basic point out there. And on China's case, you're completely correct that they benefited enormously from globalization. But remember that they've built such an export power machine that even today, in the middle of deglobalization and the middle of China plus one, their exports are still growing very rapidly and stuff. And the second point I'll make about China is that it's a country that is, I turned bearish on, but let's not take
So
away
are you
the credit.
marginally bearish on China? Massively bearish on China?
I'd say that what's happened today is this, and this is a real problem for me. 5 years ago, when I was bearish on China, I felt it was an unconventional view because it was very different. Today, even though I remain somewhat bearish on China, I feel it's become a universally accepted view. As an investor, I'm never comfortable being in the universal consensus view because I think that, there's everyone's onto it. But for India's case, one very important point I want to make. People keep talking about the Chinese, China and stuff like that. Remember that benefiting from globalization, but the kind of reforms that China carried out we don't have the capacity to carry out. In the 1990s, China laid off in its public sector enterprises nearly 100 million people. Do you think we have the capacity for laying off in our public sector even 1 million people? Right? So they carried out ruthless capitalism. They had no welfare state. It was like people need to go and do whatever they feel like in China. We don't have the capacity to do that. So yes, China benefited a lot from globalization, but China also carried out these kind of economic reforms, which we in our polity find it very hard to follow through on. So let's say that. But the broad point I take with you, which is the fact that it's very difficult in this era to grow at 10, 12%. It's very difficult. You can do, but there's no point even talking about it. But the basic point is at a 6%, kind of economic growth rate, the math doesn't add up to, these goals of being a middle income or forget even a developed country.
So if you were to advise the government at this moment, given the political reality in which the economy operates, what do you think are the easy wins that can be pressed into play, which will help the Indian economy grow faster than it is at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say it's basic stuff, right? Which is like the regulatory state in terms of that. The controlling the investigative agencies. How do you improve private sector business confidence further in India? It's nice to talk about wealth creation. I mean, there was a period when even the government, even this government, as you said, that even perceived to be, was not seen to be very friendly towards business at one point in time. And the mindset was that most businesses, tend to be corrupt and all that sort of stuff. So even there's been a change even in this government's policy response to that. But I'd say that surely something can be done about the regulatory state, that the amount of regulations we still have to deal with to open up a business in this country, to shut something down, or to having to deal with it on a daily basis. I'd say that so much of the microeconomic reform needs to happen about how to make this a place which is better to do business on. And I feel that that is something which on the ground, when you travel, you speak to small and mid-sized entrepreneurs, I feel there's so much more which can be done there, which does not require any great parliamentary approval. Fine, I agree that getting land reform done, getting even privatization done, you can argue is that. But so much can be done to make the life of the average citizen easier, rather than having to face this scrutiny, that scrutiny. I mean, there's a lot of wear and tear that happens on a daily basis, and that's the kind of microeconomic reform that I would love to see the government do.
Finally, is it easier to call the markets or to predict what's happening in politics?
I don't know in terms of, I think luck's involved and stuff like that, but I'd say that I would have not expected this, which is that before the election, in terms of that, I would have thought the market would have reacted even more negatively to the thing, but the market's been much more resilient. So prima facie, it seems that the markets are more difficult to call than the election, given what we spoke about in May and June.
Thank you very much, Ruchir Sharma, for joining us. Lots of thoughts to chew on for everyone sitting here. I'm sure everybody's wondering, okay, which are the other developing markets I can start investing some money in as well. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Rahul. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruchir Sharma, for that very enlightening session. Please stay on the stage for a bit. May I request Rahul Kanwal to present a memento to Mr. Ruchir Sharma. Begin, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharma.